Silas Ward pulled on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop in front of the old wooden gate of the ranch. He expected to see a rotting house and broken fences, but instead, he was stunned by the scene before him. 8 Apache women were hanging from nooses right at the gate. Their bodies swayed in the wind, long hair dangling, faces pale and purple, necks tightly bound by freshly tied ropes. Beneath their feet was a wooden sign driven deep into the cracked, dry ground. "This land is cursed. Step on it, and you will share the same fate." Silas jumped off his horse, heart pounding like a hammer. He climbed the fence, drew the knife from his belt, and cut down the first rope. The limp body fell, still barely breathing. He moved on to the second, then the third. One by one they dropped onto the scorched earth, their eyes barely open, gazing up at him, a fragile mix of pain, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. He knew who they were and why they were here, but Silas understood one thing. Someone had hung them there to send a message. A warning. A bloody claim of ownership. Above him, vultures began circling the sky, their shadows sweeping over the ranch gate like an omen. Silas gripped the handle of his knife tighter. He did not know what was waiting behind that rotting wooden door, but something in his gut told him his life would never be the same again. That night, the wind swept through the roof of the old wooden house, carrying the scent of ash and the memories of a long-lost time. In the large room, now blanketed in cobwebs and dust, the 8 Apache women lay still on rough blankets Silas had just laid out. Their breathing gradually steadied, and the purple hue left by the deadly ropes began to fade from their faces. The next morning, as the sun cast golden light over the prairie, the eldest woman, her deep black eyes like bottomless pits, spoke in a raspy voice. "We were once saved by your grandfather." Silas froze. Her words opened a door to memories he had never known. 20 years ago, when war broke out between the Apache tribes, their village had been invaded and burned by a militant alliance from the south. Their families were slaughtered, their homes destroyed, and they fled, lost in the chaos, running for their lives. When they were on the brink of death in the desert, it was a white man who rescued them, Silas's grandfather, Jeremiah Ward. Jeremiah did not just give them water and food. He opened the doors of his ranch so they would have a place to stay. He treated them like family, gave them land to farm, taught them how to build homes, and protected them from their enemies. He was the first man who did not see us as savages, another woman whispered, tears streaming down her sunburnt cheeks. He called us family. But that happiness did not last. One stormy night, Jeremiah died suddenly. The papers said he fell off his horse and struck his head on a rock, but the 8 women knew the truth was not so simple. They had seen strange men lurking near the ranch days before. They had overheard heated arguments between Jeremiah and a merchant named Victor Hallberg, the man who had tried many times to buy the land and failed. And they had seen a blood-stained coat buried in the stables the morning after. Since that day, they had carried both grief and a vow to uncover the truth about the man who saved their lives. But Hallberg had money, he had power, and he used both to bury what really happened. He bribed the police, falsified investigation reports, and crafted a story about an accident that everyone believed. For 20 years, the 8 women lived quietly here, collecting every shred of evidence they could, a piece of bloodied cloth, a secret mining map, a torn-up threat letter. But it was still not enough to bring down a man like Hallberg. And now, the eldest woman looked at Silas, with eyes filled with both despair and hope. "He has come back. He hanged us to clear the way. He wants to erase every witness and make your grandfather's land his own." Silas remained silent for a long time. Outside the window, the wind swept across the scorched fields, like the whisper of a grandfather long gone. And deep inside him, a fire had been lit. This time, Hallberg would not hide his crime behind wealth and influence. Not when Silas was standing on this land. The story the 8 women told was just the tip of a massive iceberg. As Silas began connecting the details they remembered, he realized his grandfather's death had not been some random accident everyone once believed, but a murder meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. Jeremiah Ward was not just a kind man who helped the vulnerable. He was also one of the few people who knew the greatest secret of this land. A massive gold vein buried deep beneath the ranch. Jeremiah had kept that secret his entire life, refusing every offer to sell the ranch even as Victor Hallberg raised his price year after year. Gold is not worth selling your soul, Jeremiah once told his friends. That refusal was what signed his death warrant. On a stormy night, Halberg sent men to infiltrate the ranch. Jeremiah was poisoned during dinner, and then the scene was staged to look like he had fallen off his horse and died out in the fields. The police ruled it an accident, and no one looked further. But the 8 women knew the truth. They had seen shadows lurking in the stables, had found a scrap of expensive fabric that no one on the ranch ever wore, and they had kept that secret for 2 decades. During those 20 years, Halberg expanded his power. He bought off officials, gained control of the mayor, the judges, even the sheriff. He used money to turn lies into truth, and truth into something no one dared speak about. The Ward Ranch, which rightfully belonged to Silas's family, was gradually marked as abandoned land with no clear ownership. Once again, Halberg tried to buy it, but the 8 women who lived there had stood in his way by holding on to and caring for the land. To Halberg, they were a thorn in his side. He knew their existence not only blocked his plan to exploit the gold mine, but they were also living witnesses who could expose his crime. And so, he decided to end it all with one brutal act, hanging them at the ranch gate. The hanging was not just an act of murder, it was a declaration of dominance. He wanted the entire town to believe the Ward land was cursed, a place no one dared to approach. A haunted land. A dead zone perfect for him to mine the gold in secret, without drawing attention. Silas said nothing as he listened to the story. Every detail cut into his heart like a blade. His grandfather had died protecting this land. The 8 women had lived in fear for 20 years to preserve the truth. And now, he, the one who carried the Ward blood, would be the one to finish the war his grandfather died trying to start. Outside, the blood-red sunset soaked the entire horizon. Silas clenched his fists, and for the first time in years, the look in his eyes was no longer that of a confused heir, but the gaze of a man preparing for a fight to the death. 20 years is a long time to carry pain, and even longer when you are bound to a vow yet to be fulfilled. For the 8 Apache women, every passing day on this land was a silent battle, not fought with guns or blood, but with patience and a deep, unrelenting fury. After Jeremiah Ward's death, Victor Halberg wasted no time expanding his reach. He bribed nearly every part of the local government, from the land registry office to the courthouse and even the sheriff himself. Vital records of ownership vanished from archives, and the geological maps showing the gold vein beneath the ranch were stolen in a break-in no one ever investigated. To the town, Jeremiah's death was just a tragic accident, and the land slowly fell into the category of abandoned property with no legal heir. But Halberg had not counted on one thing. 8 living witnesses still remained. They did not run. They did not surrender. They stayed, planting crops in the soil, rebuilding the fences, and keeping the flame of memory alive through the scorching summers and relentless rains. Each of them had a task. One woman traveled across the nearby towns, searching for anyone who had seen Halberg with Jeremiah the night he died. Another quietly gathered information on suspicious land transactions. One secretly photographed forged court records. Another traced the trail of bribe money through bank records. Even so, their fight was like battling a monster with 100 heads. Every time they found a new lead, Halberg bribed another official, made another piece of evidence disappear. Each time they got a step closer to justice, he pushed them 2 steps back. And for 20 years, no one dared to stand with them. Until he began to feel fear. He knew those 8 women were not just survivors, they were a curse on his future. If even one of them ever found the right lawyer, or met a Ward heir with the courage to fight, the entire empire he had built on blood and greed would come crashing down. So Halberg chose to end everything in the cruelest way possible. He hired 10 men, loyal enforcers who would do anything for money. This time, their job was not to kill quietly like before. Their mission was to send a message, to hang the 8 women right at the ranch gate, where anyone passing by would see. He wanted to turn the Ward land into a dead zone, a place no one would dare to step foot on, believing it to be cursed. A place buried in silence like a grave, while he quietly extracted the gold beneath without needing to explain to anyone. But he did not count on one thing. Fate had brought Silas Ward back at the perfect moment. And now, with the fire of justice burning in his heart, the battle Jeremiah once began would no longer be forgotten, not for another single day. Thank you so much for being here. If this story reminded you of the old days' dusty sunsets and the sound of hooves echoing through your heart, then subscribe to my channel. So every day we can sit together again, and I will tell you another story from the Wild West. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise over the distant hills, Silas stood alone on the porch of the old wooden house. He gazed out over the dry grass fields stretched before him, once a place where his grandfather raised horses, grew crops, and where 8 Apache women had survived for 20 years like shadows of memory. But today, he no longer saw this land through the eyes of an heir. He saw it as a battlefield. Inside the main house, the women were still weak after escaping the grip of death, but their eyes had changed. Gone was the frightened stare of helpless victims. Now, in their gaze, a fire had reignited, as if they too understood that Silas's return was a signal sent by fate itself. Your grandfather once said, the eldest woman spoke as Silas stepped inside, that one day the boy would return, and when he did, justice would follow. Silas said nothing, but something powerful was stirring inside him. The story of betrayal, greed, and the death of a grandfather he had never fully known was now coursing through his veins like blood. He entered the old storage room where Jeremiah used to keep his records and began tearing through everything. Inside forgotten wooden chests, he found a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed with age. Inside were geological maps, land ownership certificates, and unsent letters from Jeremiah, letters where he had written in detail about the gold vein beneath the ranch and the threats Halberg had made. There was even a will, never revealed, declaring that the ranch had been transferred to Silas Ward years ago, something Halberg had done everything in his power to erase. The more Silas read, the clearer it became. His grandfather had not just left him a piece of land, he had left him a mission. That night, as darkness fell across the fields, Silas built a fire in the yard and invited the 8 women to gather around. He laid out the documents, the papers, and the maps in front of them. We have what he fears most, he said, his voice steady and deep as stone. The truth. And now, we are going to use it to fight back. The plan began taking shape that night. They would gather the remaining pieces of evidence, bring in a lawyer from the city, send copies of the files to the press, and if necessary, face Halberg in court. Silas also reached out to a few old friends, men who had been soldiers, who knew the law, and who held sway in the region. This was no longer just the story of 8 Apache women who had been hanged, or of a family robbed of their land. This was the story of a battle to reclaim justice, 20 years buried. And this time, Silas was not just the heir to the Ward name. He would be the one to fulfill the promise Jeremiah had left behind in blood and tears. The night wind swept across the silent land, but it no longer carried the scent of fear. In the flickering light of the fire, 8 silhouettes and 1 man stood strong like 10 warriors ready to step into a fight from which there was no turning back. With the plan now in motion, Silas knew there was no turning back. This was no longer just a land dispute. It was a battle between justice and greed, between the memory of the dead and a crime buried for 20 years. News of the 8 Apache women found hanging spread through town like wildfire in the wind. No one knew the truth behind it, and most whispered about the curse of Ward land. What Halberg wanted was beginning to take root, fear settling into the hearts of the townsfolk. But Silas would not let fear win. He and the 8 women sent copies of Jeremiah's land ownership papers to a lawyer in Prescott. He hired an independent geologist to confirm the gold vein and prepared to publish the survey maps. He also contacted 2 major newspapers in Arizona, revealing the full story behind the accident and the growing suspicions surrounding his grandfather's death. Everything was laid out carefully like a chessboard. And then, Halberg started to feel the pressure. He never expected the grandson he once called a dumb cowboy to be the one unraveling everything piece by piece. One sweltering afternoon, Halberg's 10 enforcers returned to the ranch. There was no longer darkness or secrecy this time. They came openly, riding black leather horses with pistols at their hips. Leading them was Barton, Halberg's right-hand man, the one who had personally overseen the hanging. "This is your last chance," Barton sneered. "Hand the land over to its rightful owner, or next time, no one walks away alive." Silas stood still, his hand resting calmly on the grip of his gun. The hot wind swept across the field, sending dust flying, but his eyes were cold as steel. "Rightful owner?" he said with a faint, dry chuckle. "My grandfather owned this land before Halberg's father knew how to hold a spoon. And you? You're just thieves dressed like businessmen." The air grew tense, stretched tight like a drawn bow. One of them reached for his trigger, but Barton signaled him to stop. He knew that if blood was spilled here, the sheriff would be forced to step in, and Halberg was trying to avoid that. "We'll see you in court," Barton said, his eyes full of threats. "And next time, the law will be on our side." "No," Silas replied, his voice steady and chilling. "Next time, the truth will be on mine." As the enforcers rode off, Silas knew the final battle had begun. Halberg would use every weapon he had: money, lawyers, political power. But this time, Silas had something Halberg could never buy: evidence, witnesses, and the memory of a man long gone. On the porch, the 8 women stood watching the enemies fade into the horizon. In their eyes, there was no fear left, only the quiet resolve of those who had waited 20 years for this very moment. "He would be proud of you," the eldest woman whispered. Silas did not answer. He simply looked up at the blazing sunset sky and whispered in his heart, "We are almost there, Grandpa. This time, justice will not die with you." The days that followed were a taut string of tension, stretched tighter with every passing hour. Halberg thought he could crush this uprising with money, like he had done so many times before. But Silas and the 8 Apache women were no longer frightened victims. They had prepared every step for a final blow, the one that would shatter an empire built on blood and lies. The lawyer from Prescott arrived. Original land ownership documents left by Jeremiah were copied and filed with the court. The geological surveys confirming the value of the gold vein were published in the press. More than that, the 8 women, the living witnesses, agreed to take the stand and tell their full story. From the day they fled war and were saved by Jeremiah, to the calculated murder and the horrific hanging that nearly took their lives, the press exploded. A bold headline screamed across the front page of the Arizona Daily Chronicle: "Wealthiest local tycoon accused of murder in gold mine scandal." Public outrage ignited. The newly appointed sheriff, one not in Halberg's pocket, was forced to launch an official investigation. And as the evidence Silas had gathered came to light, bank bribe records, copied mining contracts, sworn witness statements, the wall of power Halberg had spent 2 decades building began to crack. The first trial took place in a courtroom packed to the walls. Halberg walked in, no longer the smug, untouchable businessman, but a sweating man beneath the scornful eyes of the crowd. On the other side, Silas stood beside the 8 women, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. They had waited 20 years for this moment. One by one, the evidence was presented. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. No more rumors, this was cold, hard truth. An investigator read aloud the falsified autopsy report. A bank employee admitted to being paid to erase a wire transfer. One of Halberg's own enforcers confessed that it was Halberg himself who ordered them to hang the women and clear the land. Halberg tried to deny it, tried to delay proceedings, even hired some of the most expensive attorneys to twist the narrative. But this time, justice was not on his side. The truth was too clear, too painful, and too complete to ignore. When the judge read the final verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Victor Halberg is hereby found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of officials, illegal seizure of property, and unauthorized extraction of natural resources. The defendant is sentenced to indefinite imprisonment and forfeiture of all connected assets. The 8 women clung to each other, tears falling like rain. They had not only survived, they had prevailed. Jeremiah Ward, the man who saved them, had finally been vindicated after 2 decades buried in silence. Silas walked out of the courthouse to the sound of applause from the townspeople. The western wind swept down the dusty street, sending newspapers tumbling at his feet. Inside him rose a lightness he had never known before. The war his grandfather began was now over, and justice had finally won. But he also knew this was not the end. This was the beginning of a new chapter, where land once stained by blood would now become the soil from which the future could grow. That summer, the western winds blew a little softer, the sky seemed a little bluer, and the ground beneath Silas's feet felt different. It was no longer a land of tragedy, blood, and rope. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The 20-year war was over. Victor Hallberg had been convicted, his assets seized, and the Ward Ranch was officially recognized as the legal property of Silas's family. But for Silas, that victory was not a destination. It was a responsibility. On the day Hallberg was sentenced, Silas returned to the ranch as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The old house still stood, dark shingles on the roof, scratched wooden fences, and dry grass swaying gently in the breeze. But where fear once lingered, laughter now echoed. The 8 Apache women who had once hung at the gate were now beside him, rebuilding the stables, replanting the fields, and mending the roof with their own hands. They were no longer ghosts of the past. They had become the soul of this land. Each one took on a role, caring for the horses, stitching saddles, teaching Apache children to read and farm. Some evenings, when the golden sunset bathed the fields, their voices carried in the wind songs that no longer spoke of sorrow, but of hope. Silas, too, had changed. He was no longer the wandering man without a path. Now, he rose before dawn, working alongside the women his grandfather once saved. Every nail driven into a fence post, every tree planted into the soil felt like a silent promise to the man who had come before him. "I did it, Grandpa." One afternoon, the eldest woman approached him. She placed in his hand an old, worn piece of cloth. Inside it was a silver badge, something Jeremiah once wore on his chest. He used to say, she whispered, "This land was never meant only for the Ward family. It was a sanctuary for wounded souls." Silas looked out over the field, children running free, laughter echoing beneath the wide open sky. In that moment, he understood. The legacy Jeremiah left behind was not just a few hundred acres or a gold vein underground. His legacy was a home, a refuge where the vulnerable were protected, where the past could be forgiven, and where justice would always live on. As the sun set over a land once stained by blood, the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and wood smoke from the old house. Silas stood at the new fence, his hand resting on the silver badge, his eyes lifted to the glowing red sky. And he whispered to the man who had once stood here, "Grandpa, justice has returned. And this home, at last, has come back to life." In the heart of the wild desert where 8 innocent lives once dangled between life and death, there was now laughter, life, and a promise kept. A promise that justice may be delayed, but it will never disappear. Back in those days, justice was not always found in the dry ink of legal codes. It was the light sparked by people brave enough to stand tall in the darkness. They did not need fame or reward. What they carried was belief, a belief that the truth must be spoken, no matter the cost in blood, tears, or even life itself. It was those people, the ones who refused to bow to power, who refused to stay silent in the face of evil, who turned justice from an idea into a living, breathing reality. Because of them, righteousness is not just protected, it lives on with time. I feel truly honored to have shared this journey with all of you, and I genuinely hope that happiness and peace follow you wherever your path may lead. I love you all, dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Tell me, what did this story make you feel? Leave a comment down below. Type 1 if you enjoyed the story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales from the Wild West.